Now, most schools are either on half-term or they go on half-term on Friday afternoon, so they have a week away. But some suggestions are coming to the fore now that local authorities are urging head teachers to reintroduce measures in our schools, both primary and secondary. But let me get the latest information from the coalface, as it were. Let me turn to the National Education Union. Dr. Mary Bousted is its General Secretary and is joining me on a Skype call right now. Dr. Bousted, thank you for being with us. What are you hearing from your colleagues actually in schools? Are changes afoot?
Yes, it's a mixed picture, but definitely schools, school leaders, and indeed some local authorities are working with local public health officers to reimpose some safety precautions against COVID transmission, particularly in secondary schools. And
what would they be, typically, do you think?
Some are reimposing mask wearing. Others are saying that bubbles should be re-established, not to send every child in the bubble home if there is an infection, but just to keep groups of pupils as separate as they can be in school, so that that you can suppress transmission more effectively than you can if there isn't some separation. Schools are looking at a range of things which can be done, and local authorities are also getting involved. For example, in Cumbria, the siblings of children who are diagnosed with COVID, they're advising that they should be kept at home until they come back with a negative PCR test. So there's a range of measures being taken. Of course, it would be much better if government got involved in this and helped schools make make recommendations or require schools to do things to suppress transmission. And are you aware of any directive to that effect from the Department of Education? No, we wrote to the Department of Education along with other education unions, and that was on the 8th of October. And we said, you really do need to get involved. And if you want, children to stay at school, and the other issue, of course, is teachers are getting ill. And so it's becoming more and more difficult in some areas where there are very high infection rates to have a to have a teaching workforce in schools, because teachers are getting reinfected with COVID. And we wrote to them and said, you've really got to get involved, and you have to do something about the surge of infection in secondary schools. So we've now got the case where the highest rate of infection by far is in secondary age pupils, and they are seeding that infection back into the community. And so we wrote to the government and said, why don't you reimpose a mandate of mask wearing in schools? What are you doing to support better ventilation in schools? Because we know now that COVID is largely an airborne virus. We haven't had a response to that letter. Nothing at all. You took the question out of my lips there. I was going to say, what did they get a response? And the response was zilch. Nothing. Absolutely nothing to date. Okay. Is it the case, as I've seen an opinion, and one doesn't want to err on the hysterical here, but it seems almost by default the approach of the government, particularly to schools in England, seems to be let herd immunity be established. We're not minded to put greater controls in, and we know, and I'm sure you've heard from your colleagues at from the teaching side of things, that the amount of COVID in schools is extraordinary at the moment, isn't it? It is absolutely extraordinary. It's going through the roof. I mean, the latest figures where on the 19th of October, 70,000 pupils were absent with COVID. Now, those are the cases that we know about. Of course, the issue with secondary pupils who can transmit it more than primary school pupils, although they do have some transmission as well, is that many pupils will be in school and will be asymptomatic. And what I can't understand is when a child has a confirmed COVID case in a secondary school, their close contacts are only advised to get a PCR test. They are not required to get a PCR test. If they don't get that test, and the vast majority of them don't, they come back into school. They may well be infected, may well not know about it, but will spread and transmit the virus further. And I don't understand why the government in September just abandoned the safety measures which had been working in the summer term, because we predicted, and indeed it was entirely predictable, that case raises of COVID would rise exponentially if safety measures were abandoned as they were. And yet there is, I'm sure we can all agree,
a great requirement that teaching and learning should go on uninterrupted or be re-established, because there's a whole cohort of youngsters, particularly in senior schools, who've got some catching up to do. How do you balance those two competing needs, Dr. Bousted?
Well, they're not competing, are they? I mean, absolutely. The last thing anybody wants to do is close schools. But at the moment, schools are dealing with teachers and support staff who have been reinfected with COVID and are off school. That makes running a school really difficult, because how can you teach the full timetable if your teachers are off with COVID? So there's not a competing demand. If you keep schools open, let's do what is necessary to keep schools open. If it is necessary to reintroduce a mask mandate, if it is necessary to introduce ventilation units into schools so that you clean the air in crowded classrooms, if it's necessary to reintroduce bubbles, not to send everyone home, but to stop mixing. Why is it not a requirement that if you're a close contact of a pupil who's got COVID, that you're not required to go and get a test to find out whether you've been infected too? All of these things would dramatically reduce the rate of transmission in schools, and make it far less likely that children are missing school. They would make it far less likely that teachers are missing school because they've got COVID. These things, these safety measures, are there not in competition with, but in order to enable unfettered access to education for the nation's pupils who need the education, and for their teachers who want to teach them.
Dr. Mary Bousted, thank you very much indeed. Dr. Bousted's the Joint General Secretary at the National Education Union.